Welcome to Puro Politics, the Express News' podcast of San Antonio politics. I am business editor Greg Jefferson. I'm filling in for columnist Gilbert Garcia, who is allegedly on vacation this week. Allegedly. I mean, I've never actually seen him on vacation, so I'm hesitant to say he is, in fact. And I am joined by
outgoing City Hall reporter Dylan McGuinness
and incoming City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter.
And I think this is Josh's first appearance on our podcast. He'll be leaving my business desk in a couple of weeks to join the City Hall Bureau, so welcome. So this week we had a lot going on, actually, for being in the very pit of July. We had some more threats to the city's paid sick leave policy. So, Dylan, you want to tell us about that?
Yeah, so late last week, the city received a letter from attorney Ricardo Cedillo, who said that he was notifying the city that he intends to file a lawsuit, basically hoping to get the policy stopped so that it can't take effect as it would on schedule August 1st. This was, I think, a step a lot of people anticipated or were expecting after the legislature didn't preempt the ordinance, which many people were expecting it to do. A lot of people just turned their eyes to the Bexar County Courthouse and said, when is the lawsuit going to be filed?
And so who is Cedillo representing?
Yeah, so it's I think it's like near 10, around 10 groups. There's staffing agencies, temp agencies. The San Antonio Restaurant Association is included. So it's these various kind of business trade groups or associations that are hoping to get the policy stopped. And for those who don't know, the policy mandates a minimum amount of paid sick time off for workers. And it's kind of like a different scale. So for employers with between 6 and 15 employees, they have to provide 48 hours, and the larger group has to provide 64.
Yeah, so Mayor Ron Nirenberg started out as kind of lukewarm on this. He was not a rabid supporter of paid sick leave, although he was presiding over the council when it passed the ordinance back in October, I believe, August. And, but he declined to defend it in the state legislature when it was under attack by Republican lawmakers. Yeah. And I've seen a statement from his office saying he will defend it, and he's going to go on. We've got an August 1st start date, and he's still working to that, to help businesses prepare for that date. Is there any reason to think his support is less than full-throated at this point?
I don't think so. So part of the kind of issue with paid sick leave is that it was born out of these kind of really peculiar circumstances, right? So if you go back to August of last year, the Texas Organizing Project and a few other groups come to City Hall with 144,000 signatures, which was double the amount they needed to get the policy on the November ballot, which is what they're intending to do, and like around 10% of the city's population. So
yeah, and
it was a show of force.
Yeah, and they collected that in no time. Yeah. As far as petitions go, it was like a month and a half.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy. So the city was in this kind of like weird spot because a lot of the members didn't outwardly express support for the policy, but they were worried that if they put it on the ballot, then they had this like weird conflicting message because they were already in an intense, obviously, charter campaign with the fire union. Mm-hmm. So instead of doing that, and they say they were fairly confident that voters would have passed it, which would have left them kind of without the flexibility to change the policy, adapt the policy, move the policy around. So instead of sending it to the ballot, they just adopted it outright.
Yeah.
And that's when the mayor says, I don't think cities should be dictating these policies, but I'm in support of paid sick leave generally, and I think it's the best move for the city to adopt it outright now. Right. And that's why when you get to the legislature, he doesn't defend it. So obviously, I think when the lawsuit was filed, the first question was, does he defend it now? And the policy was pretty clear that he intends to do so, and that he intends to continue. Because one of the things the attorney wrote was, let's meet before I file a lawsuit to see if there's anything else we can do, which the city accepted. So at that point, it seemed like maybe there was a possibility that the city itself would delay the implementation date of the policy, which is August 1st, but they don't meet again before then. So they would have had to call a special session. I think it's just going to go on, and it's going to go to litigation, and I think most people feel like the fate of this paid sick leave policy and others in Austin and anywhere else in the state is going to end up being decided by a judge or ultimately the Supreme Court.
Right. Now, the Austin ordinance was tossed out of court. I mean, they judge there ruled against it. Is there any likelihood that it would survive a legal challenge here? I mean, if it's brought along kind of the same lines.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on kind of judges. We see this at the federal level often, right, where different appellate districts rule differently on policies, and that usually ends up getting resolved at the National Supreme Court. It's the same thing here. So the district judge actually in the Austin case upheld the policy. It was struck down by the appeals court, which is outside of San Antonio. San Antonio is outside of that district, so it doesn't apply to us. The city of Austin has asked the Supreme Court for another ruling. They haven't yet accepted that case, but the attorney in this case, who's suing San Antonio, is basically making the argument that we should wait until the Supreme Court clarifies for everyone whether or not the city is able to even do this before the city implements its policy.
Right.
Which is a view that obviously the city, as of yet, doesn't share.
Yeah. So the attorney who made the statement last week, he represents, the San Antonio Restaurant Association and several temp agencies and smaller companies. So we haven't heard from the chambers of commerce and kind of our generally recognized business leaders. So Josh, I mean, what are you hearing from the bigger fish in the pond?
Well, what's interesting to me about this is that the business lobby wanted this done at the legislature. They wanted the state to quash this. They had the blessing of Governor Greg Abbott, but then it gets into a bit of trouble in the Senate where Senator Brandon Creighton inserts language that will basically nullify cities' ability to enforce their non-discrimination ordinances when it comes to LGBTQ folks. So that kind of sets off, this sort of standoff between the House and the Senate because the House went and reinserted that language. But basically what that creates is sort of like a dynamic where the business lobby is no longer able to sort of depend on Republican lawmakers to execute on these sorts of sort of meat and potatoes sort of things without turning it into a big fight over, say, social issues.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, do you feel like business leaders, executives who supported Nirenberg in his mayor's race, are they feeling stung at all? Or had they already kind of taken his support of paid sick leave as a given and just said, okay, well, we'll just have to live with it and support him anyway?
So I haven't gotten that sense yet. Before the election, the support was obviously a bit more lukewarm. It was either that or be faced with sort of like a wild card in Greg Brockhouse. So I haven't gotten any of that senses, but my guess would be is that they kind of accepted this going in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So we'll see if a lawsuit actually gets filed by this group or if they can work something out with the city. In the meantime, we've had, and this is always the fun part in any kind of transition between city managers, and also when you have a mayor who kind of barely squeaked by in his reelection campaign, you have a big shakeup. So we've seen at least 2 department heads in the last week take off. We don't know, or maybe we do. You can tell me whether they sought greener pastures on their own or whether they were highly encouraged to find something else to do. And we've had some shakeup in the mayor's office. But let's start with the department heads. Josh, what have we seen in the last week?
So last week we saw, this is on Friday, the Economic Development Director, Renee Dominguez, who's been with the city for the past decade, and for most of that has been the head of economic development. So when you see that the city gives, say Credit Human or USAA or Hulu a tax abatement agreement or a grant to bring jobs here, that's what he's doing. He's negotiating those sorts of deals. And last week it was announced that he would be joining the Texas Research and Technology Foundation. It's basically a local nonprofit as CEO, COO, Chief Operating Officer. Basically, back in February, he was in charge of negotiating a $5.7 million incentive package for the Texas Research and Technology Foundation to basically redevelop this. It's called the Merchant's Ice House. It was an old industrial site on the east side, and now it's going to be basically sort of like this bioscience hub on the east
So
side.
you're telling me that the economic development director for the city that helped negotiate this incentive package worth $6 million, is that what you said?
About $6 million.
About $6 million, with this nonprofit, then took a job with that nonprofit? How could that be, Josh Fechter? What's going on there? Did you ask anybody about that?
Well, I asked TRTF what they was this because he got them the deal, and they said no, but they kind of saw him during these negotiations and admired his leadership skills is what they told me.
His prowess in giving them $6 million in public subsidies. Nice. Okay. Well, what about the other department head?
So that's Xavier Rusha, whose name I might be
You
horribly pronouncing.
Urutrea, I think.
Yeah, I'm going to leave the pronunciation to you there. So he was the parks director for a long time. He left. He's going to be joining the Alamo Colleges as a special assistant, I believe, to Dr. Flores, who leads that college district. That seemed like it was on his own accord. I don't have any information to suggest that it was not on his own accord.
Right.
In City Manager Eric Walsh's memo to staff, he basically said it's with mixed emotions that I tell you that he's leaving for this other job. So it definitely seems like that was something that he was just offered this job and was excited about it.
Yeah. So I mean, as we've seen, we just crossed the 100-day mark for Eric Walsh, which is just let me say, it's an utterly meaningless benchmark for a city manager. Who cares if they've been on the job 100 days? That's nothing in city manager time.
Especially when the last city manager was here for 14 years.
Right? Yeah. But
how many days is that?
Who knows? We don't care. So, given that, and you look at these two department heads, they were both Scully people. I mean, they were, she had a lot of regard for both of them. I mean, do you think it could have just been a matter of, this is not Scully. We don't know what the future is like under Eric Walsh. We don't have the kind of relationship with him that we had with her, and we're taken off. Or is there more to it?
I mean,
Dylan,
it's hard to know. At this point, I think everyone in city staff, every director is a Scully person just because of the sheer size of her tenure that,
right.
She was able to either replace or appoint the leaders of every department. So I think it's a little bit too early to tell as of now if this is, just kind of a sign of change between Scully and Walsh or something more. I think it's too early to tell that at this juncture, but I think it's certainly something to keep an eye on going forward. When on Eric Walsh's first day, he made some staff shakeups that I thought were more kind of indicative of where he was trying to go. He named Maria Villagomez, who was the other finalist for the job that he ultimately got, as his kind of to backfill his position as a deputy city manager. And he promoted Colleen Bridger, who is the head of Metro Health, to assistant city manager, and she's been very kind of visible in that role, taking on domestic violence issues and doing the implementation work for paid sick leave. So it'll be an interesting kind of story to keep an eye on going forward, how much he continues to shuffle that staff.
Yeah. So what in God's name is going on in the mayor's office?
So the mayor's
another
office,
round of shakeups.
Yeah, we wrote a couple weeks ago that he had that his chief of staff, Trey Jacobson, had departed the office. We're told mutually, and had been replaced by Jim Greenwood, a long-time Valero executive who was an unpaid intern in his office before being named chief of staff, which was kind of a joke that the mayor used to make fun of him. He was a volunteer, basically. Yeah. Now we've learned that Marisa Bono, who was basically the number 2 aide to the mayor in his first term, the chief of policy, has departed as well. I think that's mutual. They're saying it's mutual as well. Alex Sarabia, who was a communications aide, he is gone. And Zach Like, who was a communications and campaign guru for Councilman John Courage, has gone to the mayor's office as well. So,
Interesting.
A pretty substantial staff shakeup, I'd say. I mean, your top 2 aides are gone, and another aide is gone. It's most of your staff, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And what were there any? Was there any friction between the mayor and Marisa Bono as far as policy? Was it the way she went about her job? Any insight on that?
I don't have any insight on that. I think it was just kind of the mayor's at least has framed it as new term, standard kind of staff shakeups, that kind of thing. So I don't have any information to say that things went haywire or things got frictious between them. But I think it's certainly indicative, even if it's as the mayor's suggesting that everything is mutual and just kind of standard shakeup, that his top two aides have been replaced. And
Yeah.
I think looking at who he's replaced them with as well in terms of Jim Greenwood, it's I think a sign of things that he took the election as a sign that this now is the time to start getting things done. I think is the general mood in the mayor's office.
Any idea where Bono is going next?
I do not know where Bono is going. I think she was hired from MALDEF.
Well, yeah,
originally.
she
She's kind
was.
of a high-powered get. I think people saw her.
Yeah, I mean it was it was I think it was within I think the first 6 months of his first election as mayor. And yeah, it was. I mean, her hiring was a big deal. I mean, I think people had a lot of, especially among progressives, they had a lot of high hopes.
Yeah.
It's like, Bono's coming in. This is big news. And yet it never really seemed to catch fire. And now you've got her leaving the office. So it's, there are a lot of questions about what happened in that year and a half.
I think that's an interesting kind of angle on it as well, in the sense that she, of anyone in the mayor's office, I think she had the most progressive chops. In an election where he just very actively pursued progressive constituencies to try to get over the top in a runoff campaign, I think there was certainly some disgruntling in the progressive community about naming Jim Greenwood as chief of staff. I think the departure of Marisa Bono might exacerbate those tensions.
Yeah. By the way, so how is Jim Greenwood doing with the environmentalists and the lefties who are supporting?
Yeah, so obviously mixed reactions among environmentalists and
Still,
progressives.
I mean, he hasn't changed their mind yet, or
to an appointment of a longtime Valero executive, especially when one of the mayor's top legislative priorities is a climate action deal.
Mm-hmm.
So those, on the surface at least, appear to be at odds. I know that the mayor and Mr. Greenwood have set up meetings with some of these people to kind of try to ease the tension and assure him that the mayor is the mayor. I am an aide. I'm just in charge of getting the mayor's agenda done. So, that he doesn't bring any kind of Valero spin or rhetoric to trying to change the policies.
Any sense of what Mayor Nirenberg's, with all these staff shakeups, relation with the rest of council has been like? I mean, he had a reputation for not basically consulting them on any major issues. Is that sort of changing now? Is the dialogue opening up there?
I think that's one of Greenwood's priorities. When I talked to him, he said, his top two things were, communication, and that was, twofold, was in City Hall with council members and with the community. And the way he put it was that, he needs to be getting, obviously there's 10 council members, so having a half-hour meeting with each council member every week, hard to do, but he said, could we do it once a month? Yes. And, have them spend a half an hour together strictly on the priorities, and then all the kind of, logistical stuff that's on the staff to kind of iron out afterwards. So I'm not sure if he's, begun officially doing those meetings, or if they're even something that's on the calendar or something more informal as just going to the floor. But that's definitely something that Jim Greenwood has prioritized in taking over the mayor's office.
Yeah, and I think when council gets back to work in August, I think by the end of the budget cycle or the budget season, around mid-September, you'll have a pretty good idea of how it's going with Jim Greenwood and the mayor's kind of retooled office. So in the meantime, we had last week the city won pretty good court victory against Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton regarding the sanctuary city law that legislature passed in 2017. So, Dylan, tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was the first lawsuit that Ken Paxton filed under what was known as Senate Bill 4, which is a controversial law. I think it was passed in 2017, right? That was supposed to penalize so-called sanctuary cities. It created penalties for local officials who created policies that encouraged not cooperating with federal authorities in enforcing immigration laws. And the lawsuit against San Antonio stemmed from the similarly controversial event in December 2017, where San Antonio police responded to a tractor trailer on the east side that was suspected, and I think at this point was definitely used to smuggle migrants into San Antonio. And as San Antonio Police Chief William McGuinness puts it, he was on scene. He took the 12 people into custody, interviewed them, but didn't have any reason to keep them, gave them to immigration advocates and attorneys, which I believe was the source of a new policy that had stemmed from an earlier incident with a tractor trailer in which people had died. It was this sort of kind of related event. He said that federal immigration officials were on scene and had every opportunity to do their job and didn't.
Yeah, they disputed that, but yeah, I mean,
they
he was
that.
like,
but when they disputed that, they said, we offered our assistance and he declined,
Right.
which I think most people on the city side would say offering your assistance is very different than saying, give us these 12 people, we want to enforce immigration laws. Anyways, and then the driver of the truck is arrested and charged with a state smuggling crime instead of a federal smuggling
right.
crime.
So, and that's another point of
Contention,
contention. Yeah, that it wasn't brought under federal law.
Yeah. So Ken Paxton, nearly a year later, I think it was last November, he filed this lawsuit under SB4, basically saying that San Antonio officials, A, have a policy of not cooperating with federal immigration officials, and B, materially limited the enforcement of immigration laws with the way they handled this incident. A judge last week, or 2 weeks ago now, it was July 2nd, he issued this order. The city, when they responded to the lawsuit, basically said, all these allegations are false. We don't have a policy against cooperating with federal officials, and we did not materially limit the enforcement of federal immigration law in this case. But even if we did, you can't file this lawsuit because at the time of this incident, December 2017, SB4 was under a federal injunction. And that had its roots in a separate lawsuit that San Antonio and other cities filed in federal court trying to get SB4 declared unconstitutional. And they had won a temporary injunction from a district court in San Antonio that was later reversed, not entirely, but in most parts, by the Fifth Court of Appeals in New Orleans.
Right. So is Paxton's lawsuit, is it going to limp on, or is it just...
Yes, there's still other issues at play here. I think the remaining one mostly centers around whether or not San Antonio has this general policy of not cooperating with federal immigration authorities. The city adamantly denies that charge. They say they turn people over all the time. But it was a pretty substantial victory for the city in the sense that, these three clauses or three complaints that the Attorney General had filed were tossed out.
Well, when it was under injunction, after Judge Garcia basically, I believe he said that that you could keep the portion that allows state officials to charge and remove city officials with civil offenses in place. Was that in place at the time of this initial incident?
I'm not sure about that specific clause, but the clause that Paxton cited in bringing these three complaints as part of the lawsuit was a clause that mentions material limiting, and that had been struck down by Garcia. So at the time of the incident in question, the law that Paxton was citing, or the part of the law that Paxton was citing, was under an injunction. Later lifted, and so basically the city is saying, there's longstanding jurisprudence that says you can't enforce a law that's under an injunction at the time, even if it's later reinstated. And the state is arguing, this was wrongly enjoined. The appellate court later recognized that we should be able to enforce it.
Yeah, because I think SAPD changed their policy. At first, they were not allowed to ask about immigration status, and then after the Garcia ruling, they were allowed to. They were then allowed to ask about that immigration status, but it wasn't considered a high priority. It was a low priority sort of question.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure about that. I believe what the state is using to argue this remaining question of whether or not San Antonio has a policy is the police handbook. And again, the city adamantly denies that charge, and I think the judge's ruling is at least an indication that he's probably viewing it in the city's perspective as well.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it this week at the police handbook. So we're gonna close the police handbook.
That's homework for
and
next week. Read the police
yeah,
handbook. And,
homework for next week. And so for this week, we're done here. But come back next week. We'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks.